This is the Voice of Golf Show with Peter Kessler.
Welcome to another episode of the Voice of Golf Show. I'm Blaine Stenson, and joining me as always is Peter Kessler. And with the Ryder Cup coming up at the end of the week, we thought it was a perfect time to talk a little Ryder Cup. So, Peter, maybe you could take us back to 1927 and tell our listeners, and particularly young listeners, how the Ryder Cup got started.
What a great year in sports that was, too. Babe Ruth hitting 60 home runs, Bobby Jones winning the British Open at the Old Course and leading all of the way. And that was the first official Ryder Cup in 1927 as well. They had a couple of false starts prior, but by 27, they got it all organized. Walter Hagen would be the captain for the first 6 versions of the Ryder Cup. Most of those matches were split. And the idea came from a businessman, Samuel Ryder, hence the name Ryder Cup, who donated the cup. And the figure on the top of the cup was actually an English player by the name of Abe Mitchell, who happened to be Sam Ryder's teacher. So that's how that part came about. And the early matches were basically split. Hagen was a captain for the first 6 times up until World War II stopped the proceedings. And after that, Ben Hogan was the next captain. And of course, from that point forward, for dozens of years, the Americans were far superior. The game had really become one dominated by America, starting actually in 1913 when 20-year-old amateur Francis Ouimet beat the best 2 players in the world, Harry Barden and Ted Ray, at the U.S. Open at the Country Club in a playoff.
And that was the movie that came out in 2006, I believe. Greatest game ever played. So it's a great film. But maybe you could tell us now. So you mentioned the dominance of the Americans for the starting portion of the tournament. And maybe you could explain to our listeners how the team went from Great Britain to Team Europe and allowing all European players into the competition.
Because the U.S. was so dominant, nobody showed up, nobody cared, nobody watched, nobody wanted to know. And it was set up as an informal, international goodwill exhibition. That was the original point of the thing, to expose golf. So in 79, it was decided to add Europe to the Great Britain and Ireland team and start to have those players join the team, which was now Team Europe, but included Great Britain and Ireland. And then things started to become interesting really right away. The Americans won the next few matches, but then Tony Jacklin became the captain in the early 80s, and he would captain the Europeans 4 times. He's the only captain who won an away match in the United States and a home match in Great Britain. And he changed everything for the players. Before they didn't have nice bags, they didn't have nice shoes, they didn't have great clubs. And the Americans had everything and looked fantastic. And that goes back all the way to the 1930s, when the American team looked absolutely phenomenal, the way that they dressed and the bags that they had and the way that they presented themselves. And so Tony Jacklin made all of those changes for the Europeans so that when they showed up, they didn't look like second-class citizens who had never played golf before. And then by the mid-'80s, the number of incredible players, Bernhard Langer from Germany, had joined the team. You had Seve on the team, Jose Maria Canizares on the team. And so everything changed because now the teams were fairly evenly matched. And so even though they were evenly matched at that point, Europe has dominated the matches ever since then. And coming into this match in New York, playing at the Bethpage, the black course that has a sign that says, if you're not a really skilled golfer, this golf course is not for you. I played there when I was somewhere between a scratch and a two handicap 50 years ago. And that was the hardest course that I had ever played. I mean, I know I didn't break 80, and I was a good player, and I put the ball in play, and I could chip and putt, but it asks so much of you, especially with the equipment that we had then, because the ball flew 60 yards shorter off the tee for everybody than it does now. The best amateurs and, of course, the professionals. It's funny because for higher handicap players, if you would use the ball from 1985 and the ball from 2025, you'd have the exact same result because the new ball, which essentially came out in 2000 when Tiger played the hard Nike ball at the US Open at Pebble that he won by 15 shots, everything at that point changed. But for the 18 handicapper who doesn't really break 100 because he gives himself mulligans and 5 foot putts and stuff, they can't hit the ball from 1985 any better or worse than the ball from 2025. So its swing speed is absolutely critical to moving today's golf ball the distances it goes. Phil Mickelson in his mid 50s is 60 yards longer than he was at the age of 29. A good analogy would be think of Reggie Jackson, the World Series in the late 70s, the third home run that he hit on the third pitch he faced as a batter was off of Charlie Huff, and he hit it 450 feet into dead center field. Well, if you would imagine a baseball then going 900 feet, twice the distance, it would leave the stadium so quickly that you would never see it in flight. And that's why you can't see a golf ball in flight now. It's the only sport where you can't see the ball in the air, but instead you get arrows and lines and words like target. And so it's simulated golf when you watch on TV because you are simulating where the golf ball is going. And so it's really been a problem. But the golf course this year is still going to be difficult at 7,400 yards.
So, with all of that said, do you have any predictions on this year's Cup? Do you think the U.S. can hold down home turf, I guess would be the best way to put it?
If they do, it's not going to be because it's home turf. I think all of that stuff is overblown. I think the captain stuff, and 19 other assistants on the tee with everybody, it's just overkill. You know, the captain's role. Let's go back to 1927, where we started our conversation, and they said to the manager of the New York Yankees, "Boy, you're a genius. I mean, look at this team winning the World Series every year." He said, "What is it about you that makes you different than all of the other baseball managers?" And he said, "Oh, yeah, I sure am a genius. I go up to Lou Gehrig and Babe Ruth and pat them on the fanny and say, 'Have a great day, boys.'" And that's the job of the captain at the Ryder Cup. Not going to influence club selection, trying to figure out how somebody played in the morning relative to who they should play with in the afternoon. It's all a bunch of nonsense because nobody knows. Once you tee up your ball, it is an individual sport again in the Ryder Cup. Everybody is making their own swings. It's not like a team at play, like a shootout at a member guest where there's 90 guys on the first tee. So it's still really an individual game. Nobody knows in advance how anybody's going to play. At 7,400 yards, the golf course really isn't that long by modern standards. It should be like 8,000 yards because they're still going to have mostly short irons into these holes, and they'll do everything they can to make the greens as quick as possible and put the pins in tough places. But the idea that the American side can set up the course to favor the U.S. team because, in theory, they hit it longer than the Europeans is total nonsense because half the European team plays on the PGA Tour, so they play the same game as the Americans do. So there isn't a favorite. And when you look on paper, you look at some of the captain's choices for the U.S., these are not exactly household names. And except for one or two names on the European side, I believe 11 of the 12 players are the same ones that played 2 years ago. And the 12th one is actually the brother of the guy who played 2 years ago. So it's the same team. So I don't think anybody's favored, and the golf course can't be set up to favor anyone. But will the crowd be noisy for the Americans and jeer the Europeans? Of course. And they're used to it and they prepared for it. And they wore headphones when they practiced to hear lots of noise in their ear to get ready, for what they're going to hear later this week. And NBC, who's going to carry it, is going to have their announcers be pro-American rather than impartial. The American announcers are going to root and say we as opposed to the Americans. But Europe will also be represented in the broadcast booth, and they're going to say we. So maybe there'll be some arguments, but I'm not crazy about the idea of what used to be called jingoism, where it's only your country that matters and the other countries don't. So it's got a little bit of that flavor, and the we versus them thing in the broadcast booth seems odd to me, but it might turn out to be a good addition. And at the end of the day, it'll end up being a great competition on, along with Oakmont, probably the toughest golf course in America.
So last question before we go. You're going to be rooting for the U.S., though, I assume?
I usually root for Europe. I always think it's better for golf if Europe wins because there's much more noise afterwards. And Europe likes to really rub it into the Americans, and the Americans go, okay, well, next time we'll do this with the captain, and then we'll talk to Tiger Woods and get his advice. So it's always better, in my view, when Europe just kicks the stuffing out of the US.
Well, if you get your house egged, we'll blame the show for that one, for letting that news out to the world. But anyways, that is all I have for you today, my friend. To all of you for joining us for our second episode of the Voice of Golf Show. I'm Blaine Stenson. He's Peter Kessler. Until next time, you be well.